Support for In the Frame, Exploring the DIA is provided by Masco Corporation Foundation. Masco is a global manufacturer of home improvement and building products.
Hello, and welcome to In the Frame, Exploring the DIA. Dürer, Rembrandt, Picasso, three of the greatest names in the history of European art. Mainly known for their painting, they also were pioneer printmakers, expanding the media that they worked in. Dürer in woodcutting and engraving, Rembrandt in etching, Picasso just about any medium he could get his hands on. We're going to be looking at prints drawn from the DIA's permanent collection, and through them, and with the expert guidance of Nancy Soyka, the DIA's curator of prints, drawings and photography, we'll explore how artists use printmaking to expand both their vision and their careers. Albrecht Dürer was born in Nuremberg in 1471. He was the son of a metalworker, a man working in a city that was famous across Europe for its metalwork, specifically its goldwork. In 1486, he was apprenticed to the painter Michael Walgemuth, and by 1490, he was his own master. Dürer traveled extensively. He went to Italy for artistic purposes, he traveled around Northern Europe looking at the new art of printing, and he occasionally left Nuremberg to escape the plague. He also once went to Augsburg, where he met Martin Luther, because Dürer was living at a time of great religious turmoil. He was, in fact, a deeply religious man himself, and we see this strain running through all of his works of art. We also see, going along with it, a wonderful and powerful realism that sometimes actually clashes with his religious feelings and sometimes very, very strongly augments them.
This is the largest engraving Dürer ever made. It was early in his career. It was just 1501, and this is to be thought of as a big print in 1500. Dürer made approximately 100 engravings. That's the side of his engraving printmaking production, and what it actually is a religious scene. And it has all the bells and whistles of a great Dürer. It has the subject couched in this wonderful landscape where a buyer, wanter of this print could want it for any reason. It's the moment of St. Eustace's conversion when on a hunting trip, he's a military guy on a day away from the army, goes out hunting and runs into a deer with a crucifix basically in his head. And it's the moment of his conversion to Christianity. But Dürer is able to couch it in this huge, wonderful landscape so it doesn't look like the typical landscape. And also, just in terms of detail, it's Dürer showing you his great, great technical ability. So in the same way that this sheet of paper overwhelms us today, 500 years ago it overwhelmed wanters of it, buyers of it, collectors, for the same reasons, because of its technical brilliance and because of its very sophisticated interpretation of a standard religious subject. The Lives of the Saints were very popular then, and Dürer capitalized on it. The Lives of the Saints were a tremendously popular subject, and Dürer chose to compose this scene in a way that would be attractive to collectors, buyers, for any number of reasons. Dürer treated the theme of the life in Christ at least 4 different times in 4 different formats. And he did it for, again, every single reason that we would think of in terms of common sense. Side by side is mounted an engraving of the same scene next to a woodcut of the same scene, but they're 2 different versions. On the left is the engraved Passion, 16 scenes from the life of Christ in engraving. On the right are 30-something, the whole series is 30-something scenes from the life of Christ in woodcut. And the 2 different mediums were intended for 2 different audiences. And the interpretation of the subject was different too. The woodcuts are more brutal, the engravings are a more spiritual version of the same story. And Dürer was working on these projects side by side. So again, in terms of style, in his mind, he could be flip-flopping and hopping among these subjects, and the 2 mediums meant 2 very different things to him. Woodcuts were the more popular, more common way of making prints around 1500, and what happens is that the artist literally cuts every line out of a flat block of wood with knife-like tools. So you can imagine, to make anything you see that is black was made because it was printed from a raised portion of the wood, and the artist would have had to cut literally the left side of the line and the right side of the line out of the block of wood. And they would have been made based on Durer's drawings. The artisans were so skillful that Durer turned over his drawing to someone he had complete confidence in to transfer that drawing to the wood block and cut the lines to the same kinds of thicknesses and sinuous kind of curvilinear flow with which he drew them.
The very first book that I bought with my own money, art book, was the Dover book of the complete prints of Dürer. And I was fascinated by many things in it. I loved knights in armor, of course. I was, 13 or 14 years old. I loved the coats of arms, the heraldry, all of that sort of thing. But I was also fascinated by Dürer's illustrations of the Book of Revelations. This is the vision of the apocalypse. It is the most extraordinary creation of supernatural events. And here Dürer attempted, I think overall fantastically well, to put them into a still visual form. And this is where you see his sense of the profoundly religious colliding from time to time with his very, very strong sense of realism, looking at the world. So it is that in the Book of Revelations, where this figure is said, it comes striding across the waters towards St. John the Evangelist, across the water. Here we see the waters in the background, and to make sure that's understood, it's a vast vista. There's a sea monster there behind, some sort of huge whale, Leviathan. But then I love this, these sort of completely undisturbed swans wandering around at the edge there, while John devours the Word of God. And my particular favorite bit is that, at least in the King James Version of the Bible, it says that the figure's feet were like columns of fire. And so Dürer has literally taken a couple of Doric columns and set them on fire at the top, a very, very literal way of thinking about it. You see a similar sort of thing in this print here, which is the vision of the 7 candlesticks. Here we have God the Father, whose eyes were like flames, but they're actually flaming, and whose words were like a sword, and there is a sword coming out of his mouth. But what I especially wanted to draw attention to is the fact that Dürer's fascination with woodcutting and engraving obviously had a great deal to do with the fact that he grew up in the house of a metalworker, of a great goldsmith from Nuremberg. And these candlesticks that we see around here, somehow strangely levitating in the clouds, are illustrations of beautiful pieces of Nuremberg gilt metal. And in fact, we have in the galleries a wonderful work on view at all times, a marvelous piece of Nuremberg gilt work, a double cup, done from the other end of the century actually, but it does illustrate the background that Dürer came from, with this extraordinary craftsmanship and attention to detail.
Engraving was really Dürer's passion. For his whole life, he cut or engraved his own plates. Engraving is a very different process than wood cutting. In engraving, it's really the strength of the artist's hand using a tool called a burin, almost like a V-shaped knife or tool, to push the line through a metal plate. And then the artist will ink up the plate, wipe down the plate, put the sheet of paper on top of the plate through a press. So every black line you see is a line that was engraved into the plate, and the ink sat down into that line. With engraving, you can achieve very fine, sophisticated, hard lines, and you can get much more tonality than you could in wood cutting. And engraving was what Dürer really loved. It is where his great fame comes from. He made over 200 of them in his lifetime.
Rembrandt Harmenszoon van Rijn was born in Leiden in 1606, the son of a prosperous miller. His father, in fact, wanted him to become a scholar of some sort, a lawyer, but after a while studying, following his father's wishes, he became a painter. He apprenticed with an artist called Peter Lastman, unusual in Holland at that time because this was an artist who specialized in mythological and history paintings. Rembrandt's early work is very detailed and meticulous. It is, in fact, the Leiden school, very, very carefully painted. But realizing that his talent was quite enormous, I'm sure he did, he moved to Amsterdam where he took the city by storm. He inaugurated a new kind of highly atmospheric, very personal portrait style that everybody wanted, a style that remained dominant for about 10 years. He established a studio, he married very well, and he embarked upon something that could only be called the high life. As long as the commissions poured in, that was fine, but Rembrandt was spending a great deal. And when fashions began to change, and perhaps Rembrandt made some ill-advised investments, he had to declare bankruptcy. It's famous that Rembrandt died in poverty, but that's not actually the case. In fact, he used his very strong connections to make sure that he kept the means for his work around him. He wasn't just reduced to the clothes he was standing in, he was allowed to keep his paints, the tools of his trade. And he went on working until the end of his life, dying in 1669. But the unusual thing about Rembrandt is that he went beyond portraitures. Artists in Holland in the 17th century tended to be specialists. If you painted still lifes, that's essentially what you painted. Rembrandt was unusual in that he went everywhere. He was really, I think, trying to be like Rubens. He wanted to be a great international artist in the mold of the great Peter Rubens, the great Titian, going back in the great Renaissance tradition, and that is the life that he pursued.
Throughout the history of printmaking, different mediums have been more important or more prominent or just dominant than at other times. As woodcutting and engraving were prominent during Durer's time, now in the mid-1600s, it's etching that becomes the more popular, more esteemed medium, and it's the medium that Rembrandt takes off with. It's also in terms of subject matter. It's not just with working in the etching medium that Rembrandt achieved great success or newness, it's also in his subject matter. With portraiture and landscape, they become dominant themes. Landscape was a backup in Durer's imagery. The figures, the action of the figures was prominent. Now, landscape comes into its own. You need no people. And even Rembrandt in his time would walk around Amsterdam and sketch streets and buildings and use them as a subject matter. And we can see how people of that time lived, what their landscape looked like, what their surroundings was. And that's what we get literally in his landscapes. Rembrandt's ability to convey very convincing portraiture, gesture, emotion in his figures and subjects is also a very important quality in his work. And he even examined himself so frequently through his lifetime. We know of dozens of studies where he was his own subject. He was studying simply the shape of his face. And as well, he used himself as his own model, to put himself in poses and in certain situations. Here we see him in the mid-1630s when he's a young, prosperous, prominent, handsome artist at his best. And in just looking at the world around him, not only his environment, but himself, he began creating and analyzing in a very modern sense, not unlike what we think of today in studying a subject.
In this relatively small print, Rembrandt is really pulling out all the stops. Dutch art at this time tended to be could be rather quiet. You think of the landscapes of Van Goyen, you think of the beautiful church interiors. There's a kind of Calvinist austerity to it. But this print is purely Baroque. In fact, Rembrandt here is looking at the great prince of painters, Peter Paul Rubens, and involving himself with the kind of emotional power that we associate with the Baroque movement. This is a Baroque composition. You can see these fronds from the palm leaves swaying up there. You can see this massive explosion of light up here coming down and illuminating the shepherds. There's a complete riot in the bottom of the picture here. We know that these are the shepherds, but they seem to have brought along their goats and their cows as well, and the cattle are stampeding out of the picture here. When you look down right into it, you can see a bridge that leads to an aqueduct, and then far off in the distance is the city of Jerusalem. It really is an amazing print. Rembrandt is not only comparing himself to the most famous, the most powerful, the most highly regarded artist of the time, he's really putting everything into this that he possibly can technically. It's an extraordinary print.
Rembrandt was the great rule breaker in etching. He did almost nothing via general understood principles and working methods. He varied it as much as one could. He didn't just rely on his ink sitting in those acid etched lines on his plate. He would leave films of ink on bare portions of the plate. And that's where his genius is, because he would vary the tone of his prints. on these kind of almost like impressionistic passages of ink that he would at any given time add, subtract, and that's the interesting thing about Rembrandt's prints too. You can find impression after impression after impression of the same subject, and they will change because he would have varied the way he left the ink on the plates. He would have varied the kind of ink he used. He may have even varied the kind of paper he used because he was so interested in knowing how all these factors affected his imagery. And that's the great, untraditional, modern, expansive contribution that Rembrandt made that remains so fascinating to this day. The angel appearing to the shepherds is a very complex print from the 1630s. It has all the characteristics of a quintessential Rembrandt. He wanted this piece to be seen as an example of the best he was capable of, technically and also in terms of the exuberance, the psychological drama, just simply the complexity of a scene that involves people, animals, and a celestial apparition. It was intended to absolutely captivate an audience with his genius, in fact. And in working in a night scene, in adding elements of landscape, in showing you a scene that penetrates a background, goes up into the sky, and has all these lights and darks. It is everything that a great Rembrandt etching would be early in his career, in the 1630s. Rembrandt went bankrupt late in his career, and that fact had a tremendous impact on his prints. Unfortunately, in order to recoup losses, he sold as many as 80 good plates. And in his lifetime, good impressions were pulled from these plates, but they survived. They continue to survive, and were printed from in the 18th, 19th, and 20th centuries. And a dynamic develops, much like what you see behind me, where there are Rembrandt prints that collectors should want because they show you the true nature of Rembrandt. But as these plates eroded and as printers of lesser quality worked from them, the impact wasn't the same. It was distantly removed from what Rembrandt should look like and what good Rembrandt is. And the paper's coloration can fade and change and not be what Rembrandt wanted. And simply the crispness and the clarity of that contrast between a beautiful paper and those ink lines is lost. The prints become muddy. They're just simply not sensitive. And these are all qualities that Rembrandt would have cared about tremendously. And unless one does one's homework and knows what great Rembrandt and real Rembrandt should look like, one must be very careful, because there are prints, hundreds of prints made many centuries after the lifetime of the artist that simply are not what he would have wanted anyone who admired him to possess.
Pablo Picasso y Ruiz was born in 1881, and he lived to be 93 years old. He's an artist who dominates the 20th century like no other. You may prefer Matisse as a painter purely, you may prefer Giacometti as a sculptor, but no one reached as far as Picasso did, and nobody influenced as many people as Picasso did. In fact, starting from his discovery of Cubism with Braque, going all the way through to the 50s, every artist who was working, whether it was Matisse in France or Jackson Pollock in America, they really felt they had to measure themselves against Picasso. He was voracious. He looked everywhere. He took everything. He basically almost virtually invented collage. And he was also, as you will see, an extraordinary printmaker, as he did in all of his art fields, going anywhere that he wanted to.
Picasso literally made thousands of prints. He excelled at etching and the permutations around etching and lithography, but his beginnings in etching and dry point were very, very simple. This is a print from about 1909, and his early prints right through the World War I period were very simple, not like prints any person would try when they first attempted the process. Very linear, very little tonal articulation, just the contrast of the black lines on white paper, and typically very small. From these beginnings comes the greatness of Picasso. He had the good fortune, regardless of the medium he was working in, whether it's etching in the 1930s, he teamed up with Roger Le Courrier, whether it's lithography, teaming up with Fernand Morlot after World War II, or even in linoleum cutting later. These master printmakers working side by side with Picasso, this kind of exchange between the individual who really knew the printing side with the master artist who knew what he wanted to achieve but wasn't quite sure about how to use the tools and the subtleties of the printing process, and collaborating in the print studio went on to achieve literally thousands of wonderful examples in printmaking mediums.
Picasso made prints from the very beginning of his career, from the Rose period, the famous Blue period, but he really only got going in the 1930s. The two men were responsible for this. One was a master printmaker called Roger Le Courrier, who introduced Picasso to all kinds of new techniques, and the other one was Ambroise Villard, who you see pictured here by Picasso. Villard was one of the great entrepreneurs of modern art, going right the way back to Van Gogh and Cézanne. And he invited Picasso to produce a suite of 100 prints that we now call the Villard Suite. And this is Picasso's portrait of Villard himself. It's literally, you can see Picasso's fingerprints all over this as he's drawn in and worked with the soft ground. But what to me is remarkable about this is that what the real focus, everything that makes it snap into focus, are the white areas, the areas where Picasso hasn't touched them at all. On the other hand, this etching that we see here is covered with Picasso's, with the drawing. It's very heavily shaded, all these cross-hatching marks here. It looks like a couple of nudes, a couple of models, and much of the Villard Suite is a kind of ongoing contemplation between Picasso and his art, Picasso and the model, the model and the model. But again, when you look a little bit more closely, you can see that this figure in the foreground appears to have neither arms nor all of her legs. So presumably it's some kind of sculpture. Is it then a model looking at an idealized classical sculpture? But then when you look more closely at the model in the background, at least to me, it also looks like a sculpture. In fact, it reminds me of a particular sculpture by Matisse. So Picasso is definitely talking about art. But on the other hand, again, in this picture here, Picasso goes to the opposite extreme. It's just a very, very few lines drawn swiftly with the etcher's needle. It really has an Ingres-like simplicity and sureness. And just with these very, very few lines, Picasso is able to create this sense of form and put together a composition that, although very, very sparse, covers the whole of the plate. It really is one of many of the tour de forces that make up the Villard Suite.
Linoleum cutting is a very interesting medium that Picasso discovered for himself in the 1940s and fell in love with in the 50s and continued working with well into the 60s. It's as simple as wood cutting, it's just done on linoleum, and what it permitted Picasso is not just working in glorious color, full color, but he also simplified the process. He developed a technique that permitted much more economical, much more time-saving ways of making color prints. Picasso made a few lithographs in the 1920s, and they would have been all black and white. It really isn't until after World War II when these big color lithographs are created. And that's largely because Picasso teamed up with the printer Fernand Morlot. And it's Morlot's knowledge of the printing process, the technique, and he actually thinking and saying, I think I can work with artists to make art, and inviting artists into the studio and working again shoulder to shoulder. And this is a phenomenon in the history of printmaking. It really was in the 1890s that lithography, color lithography, first had its great heyday with prints by artists like Lautrec. And because of the economy, because of world strife, war, color falls out. It's just great art isn't being made. It's simple art is being made rather than this kind of complicated art. And it's that collaboration, good times again, that make this possible. In terms of subject matter, this is Françoise Gillot, the woman who was important in Picasso's life in the 40s and 50s, as Marie-Thérèse was in the 20s, and again as Jacqueline Roch would be in the linoleum cuts in the 50s and 60s. So again, technically, progressively in terms of subject matter, we see the growth, the development, the contributions that Picasso makes in these processes that actually are quite old, but the subtlety, the nuance, and creativity that are all his.
I hope you've enjoyed this episode of In the Frame. The prints we've been looking at are all works on paper, and works on paper have to be rotated so they don't fade from overexposure to light. But this also means that there's almost always something new to see in our prints, drawings and photography. Check our website, dia.org, before coming down. Until next time, this is Graham Beale, your guide to one of America's great art museums, the Detroit Institute of Arts.
Support for In the Frame, Exploring the DIA is